Welcome to another edition of the Multipliers Pathway. I'm Todd Wilson, a facilitator in Multipliers Pathway. We've done a number of these videos that I would call core videos in the Multipliers Pathway process. This is another one of those videos. We've done other videos, if you haven't seen them, on other core frameworks like the 5 levels of multiplication, the 3 dimensions of multiplication, cultural alignment model. I'm going to do a brief review of those in this video. Over and over, you will hear us say, how we add makes all the difference. I'm going to really press into what that means in the context of some of the other frameworks we've looked at, and I'm going to press in a little bit to helping us understand the difference between addition, reproduction, and multiplication, and how we add at the level 3 addition makes all the difference on whether we're really going to see level 4 and 5 reproduction and multiplication. So let me jump in. We'll do a little bit of review and jump into some new content. We started with the level 5 framework. There are 5 levels of what we call multiplication: subtraction, plateau, addition, reproduction, and multiplication, levels 1 through 5. If you recall, about 35% of churches are subtracting at level 1, about 35% are plateauing at level 2, and about 30% at any given time are adding. That's 100% of churches have their core somewhere between level 1, 2, and 3 in our day-to-day operations. That's how it's been from the beginning of the church. In fact, this 35-35-30 split, if we could go back throughout church history, I don't think it's that abnormal. I think we'd see the 35-35-30. It's about a third, a third, a third. Where it gets interesting is that only about 7% of those churches that are at level 1 through 3, show level 4 reproductive characteristics or level 5 multiplying characteristics. That's what most of us are interested in. What does it look like to be more aggressive at reproducing and multiplying? What's holding us back, and what do we need to do to be more aggressive? We're going to press in this video to see that how we add, what we're doing between levels 1, 2, and 3 in the system that makes up level 1, 2, and 3 where all churches live, how we do our adding there makes all the difference on what kind of activity we can have at level 4 and 5. I introduced the idea of magnets. It's a matter of life that everything has a season, everything dies, people die, businesses die, churches die. I call that sort of the death magnet. We're always being pulled toward the level 1 subtraction. On the other end of the spectrum, Jesus designed his church for movemental impact, and there's what I'd call the level 5 magnet there. So you've got Jesus designed for the church, if we do it his way, pulling us toward movements at level 5. But then there's the reality of sin in the world, that death's a reality, and we have this pull back toward level 1. We live somewhere between these two magnets in our churches. We introduced the idea of 3 dimensions of multiplication. The first dimension being disciple making. It's the core way that Jesus intended we add disciples relationally. He modeled it for 3 years. Those disciples make disciples who make disciples who make disciples. We see this generational reproduction that grows out of the core addition that happens with making disciples. And after generational disciple making, we see multiplication of disciples. The second dimension is mobilization. We are to mobilize people for the purpose of disciple making. On the addition end, living in common, the Acts 2 church, insiders behaving in a way that outsiders wanted to be a part. So you had this 24/7, the people of the church living in common in such a way that evangelistically outsiders wanted to be part of insiders. That's actually a form of mobilization via the evangelism piece. On the other end of mobilization is living sent, that we are simultaneously supposed to live as the family of God, but also live deployed as missionaries into the cracks and crevices of society. We can do those first 2 dimensions, disciple making and mobilization, without the church having to scale things. We can do them on our own if we want to. But Jesus' plan is that it's through the church that we see the 3rd dimension, which is capacity building. Much of what happens with the church is how do we scale and multiply these dimensions of disciple making and mobilization. We've talked about what we've done is we've hijacked all 3 dimensions. That hijacking starts with replacing relational disciple making as the core mission and growth engine of the church, with institutional programs being our method of choice for growing. What happens when we embrace institutional programs for growth? programs never reproduce. So we lose the multiplication end of the addition spectrum because programs consume. We've got to keep feeding the consumption of the programmatic approach we have. That then impacts the mobilization spectrum. Instead of this balancing act between living in common and living deployed, we have to focus on volunteerism, making the church the greatest volunteer organization in the world. For what purpose? To help fuel our institutional programs. And then our capacity building becomes all about the local church efforts to do these institutional programs. We've got to have programs, we've got to have buildings, we've got to have staff, we've got to build our local capacity in a way that's built around this institutional programming. I call this the hijacking of the three dimensions. So by having institutional programs replace disciple making as the core method of growth in the church, we really create our core problem. It's all around this idea of how we add. When we replace Jesus-style disciple making with institutional programmatic growth that is fueled by the prevailing level 3 consumer church operating system, we become incapable of what I would call mathematical or biblical reproduction. That's because of this idea that programs never reproduce on their own. They only consume. The consequence of all this, if you want to bring it back to the magnets, where we had the depth magnet at level 1 and the movement magnet at level 5, we have embraced the level 3 consumer-driven operating system and essentially defined success as growing large, sustaining churches. We've put this magnet in place at level 3 that causes us to now live primarily between the level 1 depth magnet and the level 3 growth magnet. And we basically neuter the movement magnet at level 5. What we're talking about now in Multipliers Pathway is how do we restore that movemental impulse at level 5 and overcome this level 3 operating system. The level 3 magnet, it's prevalent in all 320,000 churches in America. We've talked about it. There is a formula on the left side of this magnet. If you're living in the level 1, 2, and 3 zone, get the right staff with the right buildings, with the right program, with the right Sunday morning services. There's almost a formula for how we grow our way to level 3 through successive growth barriers. The downside there is that the very things that we use in that formula to get us to level 3 are the same things that hold us back from getting to levels 4 and 5. Basically, that co-opting with that level 5 momental magnet, it's because this level 3 operating system's characteristics keep us from the level 4 and 5 behaviors in an unhindered way. So what I want to do is I really want to move into unpacking. That's sort of the review of where we've been. I want to walk through a series of slides to really help us understand mathematically the difference in addition and how there's a couple of different kinds of addition and then how that leads to healthy reproduction and multiplication. So let's start with addition. Each of these little boxes that you see here, all the way to the left, that represents a first generation church, the first box. And what most of us do in church, and it's a good thing, we want to grow our churches. So with time, our goal is up and to the right. Our church gets a little bigger, a little bigger, a little bigger, and we just keep trying to get bigger on the sustainability of the churches that we do. We add services, we add programs. That last cube to the right represents the addition of sites and campuses, which is another form of addition and not reproduction. So in programmatic addition, we're taking action for the institution to programmatically grow. That's our first form of addition. When we get to reproduction then, the first box to the left, let's let it represent the church, the first box down on the left, that one church in the first generation, if it keeps having babies, what we're going to see happen with each generation to the right is each of those churches keep growing. It has children, and then it keeps having children and children, and the collective attendance of all of those churches is up and to the right. And it's being done through the reproduction of that one first church having more kids. Now we get to multiplication. And multiplication is a much steeper, ever-increasing curve. And let's start with the box on the left. That's that same first church that starts having kids. But now each of the daughter churches turns around and has daughter churches who turn around and have daughter churches. That's what you call generational multiplication. when each generation that is reproduced from its parent also turns around and reproduces, we get multiplication. And if you just want to look at it in terms of the actual numbers, on the left, programmatic addition is one church that continues locally its efforts to get bigger and bigger. Locally, maybe multi-site program services, but they're not doing church planting in that programmatic addition to the left. We move to reproduction. That same church starts planting churches. They're going to see a collective attendance greater than if they weren't planting churches, and they're doing it by reproducing churches. Now, to get to multiplication, we've actually got to see that reproduction happening 4 generations into the future, broad and wide, but it's the kids who are also having kids, not just the parent having the kids, but the kids are having the kids. There's a series of principles we can extract from this math. Let's start with the first principle, really important. You can add without reproducing, but you can't reproduce without adding. Say it again, you can add without reproducing, but you can't reproduce without adding. Let's go back and look at the first chart again. The very first programmatic addition over there on the left, that's one church that never reproduces. It never plants a church, but it continues to grow. It can add numbers and it can grow without actually reproducing. But if I get to the second graph where reproduction is happening, it is impossible to reproduce, meaning to continually plant more churches and not see addition happen. So we can add without reproducing, which is the programmatic one on the left, but we can't reproduce without seeing addition happen. And so the question is, do we focus on addition without reproduction, or do we focus on reproduction and get addition? And that's really a kingdom math question that's tied up in our value system that we have to wrestle with. So the second principle, you can reproduce without multiplying, but you can't multiply without reproducing. Similar to the addition and the reproduction, but let me say it again. You can reproduce without multiplying, but you can't multiply without reproducing. So let's go back and look at the reproduction and multiplication card here. You can reproduce without multiplying, meaning in the middle curve there, one church can continue to have babies and they're reproducing. But in order to get to multiplication, the kids also have to reproduce. You can't get to multiplication without the kids reproducing. So the idea is, if the parents keep having kids, they are reproducing. But if their children don't have kids, there's no way they can multiply. So we can have reproduction without multiplication, but if we have multiplication, we're guaranteed to have reproduction. That was principle number 2. Third principle, multiplication then results from healthy generational reproduction 4 generations deep and wide. Multiplication is not something we do. It's the outcome of what we do in a healthy way with reproduction. If we add in a way that does reproduce, and over and over and over we reproduce, embedding the DNA of reproduction into our kids, we can get to multiplication. But in the absence of embedding that DNA into our kids, if our kids don't turn around and follow the plan of reproduction, we're not going to see multiplication happen. So if we just look at God's plan, God says in Genesis, be fruitful and multiply. If we really unpack how that was to happen, his way was through addition. Addition was the core of how Noah and Adam would multiply. Jesus' way, he wanted us to make disciple makers. How's that happen? It happens through addition, one at a time. A disciple who makes a disciple who makes a disciple. We see this idea of healthy addition embedded at the core of multiplication. You can't multiply without a healthy addition really forming the foundation. So we must have addition. Addition's not a bad thing. If we jump back to the level 1 through level 3 framework, I'd rather be adding than I would be subtracting or plateauing. So it's not a bad thing to want to be adding. The issue is how we add makes all the difference. If we put that level 3 magnet in a place in a way that the programmatic addition is the way we add and not through relational disciple making, we are going to get the addition without the reproduction. And without the reproduction, we can't get to the multiplication. So if we do learn from Noah and Adam, be fruitful and multiply. Noah and Adam had a choice to make when God gave them the vision to be fruitful and multiply and populate the earth. They could have taken the approach to say, I'm going to be one man that has millions and millions of kids. Forget the family, it's just one person that tries to have millions and millions of kids. But God's plan was that it would be through the family, that parents would have kids, kids would have kids, kids would have kids. We'd have this generational cycle. And fortunately, God's plan was through the family. And fortunately, Noah and Adam followed God's plan to do it through the family. I like to use the example of grandchildren here to draw this distinction between multiplying and reproducing. My great-great-great-grandchildren are probably not going to know my name. I don't know my great-great-great-grandfather's name. If my great-great-great-grandchildren aren't going to know my name, how in the world can I control anything they're doing 3 or 4 generations from now? The only thing I can do is how I reproduce my children and what kind of DNA I embed into my children. If I want to impact 4 generations from now, I do it through how I reproduce in a healthy way and how I embed DNA into my kids. And so the principle here is multiplication happens on the edges beyond the grip of my control. I can't control multiplication. I can only influence multiplication largely through what I reproduce in the generation that's right in front of me. There's 2 forms of addition. There's only 2 forms of addition that I can teach you. One is what I would call programmatic addition. Let's pretend these 2 squares here with a number 1 in them are 2 blocks, like kids blocks. If I take one block, and we can say in this case, we're a program, a service, a campus. I've got one block, program, service, or campus, and I want to put another block with it so that I have 2. The question is, have I reproduced the first one or have I added to the first one? And in this case, I have added, but I have not reproduced. That first campus, that first program, that first service, it did not do what the second form of addition is, which is called reproduction. Reproduction happens when one block, one person, one church, one organism comes out of another one and forms 2. It's kind of like when the human egg is fertilized and you have cells that are multiplying from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16. When we see 1 becoming 2, we see reproduction when it's growing out of 1 rather than putting with it. And so in this case, if you look again at the principle we said earlier, you can't reproduce. If you look at this picture, it's physically impossible to reproduce without adding. But I can come back to the previous one. It is possible to add, but I did it without reproducing. We need to be choosing the second option. To the degree we can, we want to see addition happening through reproduction. And the core of addition is Jesus' way of teaching it to us. Disciples who make disciples who make disciples. You need to picture figuratively when a disciple is making a disciple, it is like 1 becoming 2. It would be this scenario of reproduction. The principle we take here is how we add makes all the difference. Been saying it over and over. One pathway of addition produces reproduction, the other does not. Our way in the level 3 magnet with the consumer-driven operating system is a programmatic, growth-driven approach that is not capable of reproduction. Jesus' way through relational disciple making is what gives us that reproductive form of addition. So reproduction, let's now press into this idea of reproduction, what reproduction is and what it is not. I like to say there's 2 ways to test reproduction, like whether you've actually got the reproductive form of addition. The first question that we can ask in reproduction is, do the offspring of whatever the parent is have the authority and the ability to reproduce on their own without the parent's approval? So does the offspring have both the authority and the ability themselves to reproduce without having to get someone else's permission? And second is, do they actually do it? You could have, let's say, a person, a living being. A person could have the authority and the ability to reproduce as a child who grows up, but they may choose not to have kids. So they physically meet the first criteria. They have the authority and the ability, but because they choose not to reproduce, they're not reproducing. So I've got to have both of these present, authority and ability to reproduce, and that the offspring do reproduce. Let's run through, using the family unit as an example, 3 examples. In my first example, a set of parents have a child. That child then grows up and has children. The question is that reproduction? First criteria, does that child have the capability to reproduce? Yes. Does that child reproduce? Yes. 2 yeses give us reproduction, and we get addition at the same time. Our second example, the same parents have a child. That child chooses not to have kids. So our first question, do they have the capability to reproduce? Yes, they could reproduce, but in this case, the child chooses not to reproduce. So we have a no. Because we don't have 2 yeses, the child then does not add or reproduce. We go to our third example, same parents have a child. Now that child is physically unable to have kids, and it's not a choice, they're physically unable to. Now our first criteria, does that child have the capability to reproduce? In this case, no, and hence they don't reproduce. So we get 2 no's, same outcome as the previous example, the child does not add or reproduce. And these are examples just from families. Let's jump to the examples in the church now. So our first example in church is a church moves from 1 service to 2. They had an 8 o'clock service. Now they move to an 8 o'clock and a 9:30 service. Have they added or have they reproduced? And this is core to understanding the difference in addition and reproduction. Our first question then is, does the new service that was just started have the capability itself, capability and authority, without someone else's permission for it to turn around and reproduce? In other words, you go from 1 to 2 services, and now that second service, can it completely on its own, without the approval of elders, without the approval of the lead pastor, without anybody's approval, can that second service decide to have a third service? I've never met a church where that's the case. We have to say no. A church service does not have the ability to reproduce because they don't have the authority on their own to do it. And that leads us right in the middle of the page here to programs and services are inanimate things that never reproduce on their own. They have no authority, no ability, so they don't reproduce. That's because they have to get someone else's permission to do it. And when you have to get someone else's permission, you don't get reproduction. You get programmatic addition. The question you could also ask in this one is, how will we get from the second service to the third, to the fourth, to the fifth? How will we keep adding when we add more services? If there was a form where church services didn't have to get anybody's permission, a church service forms, and somehow that church service could then form its own, we'd have reproduction potentially. But in this case, because they don't have the authority, we can't get there. It's going to be through programmatic addition without reproduction. Our second example then, very similar. Now we're going to move from 1 campus or site at our church to 2. And again, the question is, did we add or reproduce? Same outcome as adding a church service. Really, that's what we're doing, is adding a new church service in a different location. That campus that we just started, in 99+% of cases in American churches, a site does not have the authority on its own to turn around and reproduce again without a central organization, the elders, the original campus, without someone else agreeing to it. Because that daughter campus does not have the authority on its own to turn around and reproduce, you can't get to reproduction. It has no authority, no ability, so they don't reproduce. Same question, how will we get from 2 campuses to 3 to 4 to 5? It's going to be through programmatic addition. That's how it's done in the U.S. church. So we see in most cases the expression of campus is programmatic addition without reproduction. I just want to say again, programs, services, and sites, all inanimate things, are incapable of reproducing and therefore can't multiply. How we add makes all the difference. I want to be real careful at this point to say programs, services, and sites are a good thing. Churches that are reproducing through church planning are doing programs, services, and sites. This isn't we've got to stop doing those things. The issue is when we build those as our level 3 operating system, that's how we grow in the absence of forms that can reproduce. we're going to keep ourselves from reproducing. So this is not a tyranny of the or of, oh, it's program, service, and sites, or it's church planting. No, we need to have program, services, and sites, but we've also got to have the church planting piece to get the reproductive impulse. So let's jump to the third example in a church. This is the really tricky one. One church plants another church. And the question is, did we add or did we reproduce? And here's why it's tricky. The first of our two questions, does the church plant have the authority, capability to reproduce? In almost every case, the answer is yes. When you plant an autonomous church, they have the authority on their own to turn around and plant another church. So we get the yes on the first question. But here's what gets us in trouble in the U.S. church. The second question then is, does the plant turn around and plant? It isn't good enough to just have the authority that in theory they could plant. They actually have to plant. And here's where we get in trouble in the U.S. church. 75% of church plants in the U.S. don't actually plant churches after they're planted. Multiplication is just 4 generations of reproduction deep and wide. Well, let that math sink in. If 75% of church plants aren't planting churches, so only 1 in 4 are, it is physically impossible for us to get to multiplication. We've got to see a much higher percentage of our church plants getting involved in church planting. We've got to see the generational planting activity happening. And so the consequence of all this, with only 25% of church plants happening through reproduction, is that we hinder our ability for multiplication. Generational reproduction is critical. I want to jump back to the 3 dimensions of multiplication before we end our time here. Remember, disciple making, mobilization, capacity building. Let's apply these questions of addition and how we're adding to this. So in the disciple making dimension, the core question is, how are we adding disciples? Are we adding disciples primarily programmatically? Are we doing programmatically, programs institutionally driven? Or are we doing it through relational disciple making? And secondly, is this idea that what you win them with or to is it will either accumulate and consume, or it will release and reproduce. Programs will accumulate people, but they'll also consume resources in the form of money, buildings, volunteers. Whereas if we are making disciples who make disciples who make disciples, we are releasing the latent capacity built up in the church, and we're reproducing and seeing an expansion that's not capable through the programmatic. So the question, how are we adding disciples, is a really important one. If we move to mobilization, it's a 2-part question. How and why are we mobilizing disciples? We're either in a posture of, we can do it, you can help. That's what volunteerism is called. We've got our programs. We need a certain number of people in kids ministry. We need a certain number of people at the front doors handing out flyers. That's a posture of, we can do it, you can help. And in some ways, as the church family, we've got to be willing to do that internally. But there's also a posture of, you can do it, we can help. That's what mobilization is more about. This is really a question of, is our core answer to how and why are we mobilizing disciples? Are we really focused on volunteerism, or are we focused on mobilizing everyday missionaries where they work, live, and play? If we're going to see gospel saturation happening throughout our geographies, we have to be mobilizing everyday missionaries. For what purpose? To make disciples who make disciples where they work, live, and play. When we jump to the capacity building question, it just becomes a very simple, how are we scaling or growing the disciple making and mobilization potential that we have? Are we building programmatic capacity to scale up our disciple making or programmatic growth and volunteerism? Or are we really building capacity through the expansion of our relational disciple making and mobilization activities? So let me just summarize what we've covered, 7 different truths and principles. Addition is the foundation of reproduction and multiplication. We're not going to see reproduction and multiplication without the right kind of addition. That's the story of Noah and Adam. The second principle, you can add without reproducing. That's that programmatic addition. We can be a church that just focuses on ever increasing growth, getting bigger, bigger, bigger without ever reproducing. But the corollary is also, you can't reproduce without adding. If we plant churches that plant churches that plant churches, we are both reproducing and adding at the same time. In fact, we're going to see larger collective numbers of people in eternity when we're trying to add through reproduction versus programmatically adding. Third principle that carries on from that, you can reproduce without multiplying, but you can't multiply without reproducing. And you see how all these are building on themselves. The right kind of addition allows us to reproduce. That reproduction produces the right kind of addition further, which further leads us generationally to multiplication. And it's all built on the healthy right kind of addition. Our fourth principle, multiplication is not something we choose to do. It's an outcome or an overflow of what we do. By focusing on healthy generational reproduction, we may see multiplication as an overflow. That's what our prayer needs to be, that we cooperate with God doing healthy generational reproduction, and we're blessed with seeing an outcome of multiplication. I just want to finish up with this idea that how we add makes all the difference. Programmatic growth is not capable of reproducing. Programs only consume. Programmatic addition stunts our reproductive capacity and holds us back from multiplication. The level 3 magnet and the consumer-driven operating system are at the core of that. Jesus-style disciple-making is the answer to the question of how we should be adding in a way that produces reproduction capable of multiplication and helps us restore that level 5 magnet. By faithfully and persistently focusing on level 4 reproduction via disciple-making, we may see multiplication. I just want to highlight here, some may think it's just a trivial thing. I'm pretty crazy about the language between addition, reproduction, and multiplication. In the church world right now, multiplication is a fairly sexy word. It's easily thrown around, and I'm going to say it's sloppily thrown around. Most of the time, you can start paying attention to it through the lens of what we've talked about in this video. Most of the time, when you hear the word multiplication, it's really being applied in what we're learning in this video is reproduction. A church can't decide they're going to multiply. We talked about it, your great-great-great-grandchildren, they're not going to know your name. So the idea that we can somehow control what's happening multiple generations into the future, the only thing we can do is seek to influence the generations that are right in front of us that we're planting. So I want to thank you for joining me in this one. I know it's a lot of math again. How we add really does make a big difference, and I wanted this video to just give a little bit more of the behind the scenes, what we mean when we say that. So thanks for joining me today.